Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. A while back I got an email from a guy called David Taylor asking if I'd ever considered looking at the cork industry in World War II. I can hear you thinking, like I did at the time, sounds a bit dull. Well, the more I looked into it, the more I got enthused by the story of cork. It was a wonder product during the early 20th century, used in all manner of things. Almost anything that needed a seal, such as a gasket, used cork. So it was crucial to the auto industry, aviation and munitions. The American government defined it as a strategic industry along with coal and steel. What makes the story more interesting is that the majority of it came from neutral Portugal and Spain. I hope I've laid out my case for why it is such a fascinating story. So I'm joined by David Taylor, who is author of Cork Wars, which tells the stories of some of those involved in the cork business during World War II, and Crown Cork and Seal, one of the largest companies producing cork products during the war. But before we get to cork, a quick reminder that this podcast is made possible by listeners like yourself becoming patrons of the show, contributing $1 or so each month, which helps me find the time to put it all together. And there is just me. I have no team of researchers, editors or internet gurus. I do the lot. So if you enjoy the podcast and would like to know more about becoming a patron, head over to patreon.com/WW2podcast or go to the website www2podcast.com and click on donate. And I thank those who already support the show. So David, thanks for joining me. I don't think people will have put much thought into this, but cork, a wonder product at the start of the 20th century. Why? I wonder if you could tell us why.
Yeah, right around the start of the 20th century, it becomes a wonder product in manufacturing and industry because of its ability to flex. Basically, the air in its cells allow it to both shrink and then resume its original shape in a very unusual property for a product. And it was when they kind of a chance discovery that when you ground it up and subjected it to heat, you could shape it into other shapes that would be useful for industry, so that you could use it to seal things. So by the 20th century, it was really, by the mid 20th century, it was really a key part of manufacturing, whether it was engine gaskets or sealing windshields and glazings for that, or creating bomb parts, anything that you needed to seal and also insulate. It was used sort of the particulate kind of ground up cork. It was put together in a sort of a sealant in a way that you could use it as insulation also.
It's funny because it's a product that I just assumed that had always been there. I hadn't quite realised that it's sort of been discovered or rediscovered.
Yeah, you're right. It had always been, it had been used for centuries, going back to the Roman Empire for buoys and for capping vases, but also always it was used kind of the original cork layer, the bark of the cork oak tree. It wasn't until the 1890s that they ground it up into this new sort of form for industrial use. So that was kind of the point where it really took off.
So we're going to be looking at Crown Cork and Seal, and that's run by the McManus family. And this is an enormous business. So tell us about the business.
Crown Cork and Seal started in the 1890s as just a bottle capping innovation to sort of using cork in the top of the bottle caps to make a new, better seal. And that took off. That was based in Baltimore, Maryland, and it was a growth industry for decades, as the timing was perfect because it came about at the same time that carbonated sodas and broader distribution of beer and other things that could be bottled. So the bottling business needed this kind of a new product for making things keep better and work better. So in the first decades of the 20th century, Crown Cork and Seal was a leader in that. Charles McManus was an inventor himself. He liked to tinker with things, so he tried more types of containers and ways to use cork industrially, so that by the 30s, when the Depression came, his business was actually still expanding.
It is an enormous... I've failed to write down the figure, but it's an enormous business. Would they have half the bottle tops in the USA or something ridiculous?
Actually, yes. The Crown and its another industry leader, Armstrong Cork, were leading in the imports of cork. So that by the start of the war, American imports of cork were about half the world's production. It was this little known, and even most Americans didn't realize how much, I think, that cork was this vital product for their daily lives. They would see it in, it was becoming popular for flooring and in cars and things, but it wasn't until actually this fire in 1940 brought government attention to it, and then the government published like an article about, cork is this remarkable material, and we really depend on it both for our economy but also for our defense use.
If we look at that, there's a fire in is it the Crown Cork storage yard? And when we say storage yard, it sounded to me like I don't know how to describe it. It's enormous, isn't it?
Yes, it's a 9-acre storage yard for cork bales. So it was right near the port. So they would import container ships full of cork from Portugal and Spain initially, and just directly put the cork into this 9-acre cork yard, as they called it, and it rose up, it would be 50, 60 feet high. This was this product that was still harvested in a very traditional way, and so it was, you would get a year's worth of the harvest at the end of the harvest season.
And there's talk of it being sabotage. I mean, I'm not sure if it's all a bit fifth column, but could there be any truth in the Germans trying to nobble the American cork industry with this September 1940? So France has fallen. Was there any potential truth in German industrial sabotage against the American cork industry?
There actually was. There was a legitimate fear. The FBI already by the fall of 1940, had been tracking several Nazi sabotage rings, including one in particular based in Long Island, New York, that they later arrested months after the Crown Cork fire. They arrested a Nazi ring and found that they did have plans for disrupting, either by bombing or fire, infrastructure facilities on the East Coast to kind of scare and just more out of fear than actually bringing down American infrastructure, but creating public fears of entering the war. So they found plans for bombing electric power stations and train lines and some factories as well. So it was a legitimate fear.
I was thinking about the threat to supply. If you take out a supply dump, you're reliant upon all your cork coming from, is it Spain, Portugal, and is it North Africa? Are they the main cork growing areas?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
So after the outbreak of war and the fall of France, and there's obviously, at this point as well, there's also war in North Africa, war must have threatened cork supply. I mean, how much of a problem is that for the US?
It was actually a big problem because, as you say, North Africa at that point was held by the Axis powers, and so the Iberian Peninsula was isolated. So Portugal and Spain were feeling the heat from Hitler, and so they were staying neutral, and it looked like there was great potential for both countries to come under the Axis umbrella, and so that all cork would be, among other things, all trade from Portugal and Spain and North Africa would be cut off, and American industry really did depend on that.
Is it such an important commodity? And I guess I was saying, is it a strategic commodity? Is that actually an official term? Did they term things strategic commodities?
They did. It was a strategic commodity, and once it was labeled that way, particularly after the 1940 fire, that determined that most uses of most imported cork would be dedicated to defense purposes. And so companies had limited power to what they could do for commercial purposes. And also it meant that the media couldn't, there was censorship of, you couldn't quote stats about how much cork was imported or about facilities. So it had other implications too.
Presumably things like steel, coal, oil are also strategic products. So cork is being wrapped with those coal, steel type products that you would normally associate as being with strategic products through war.
That's right. Yeah, I think because people would think of it mainly as like bottle caps or loose things, they would. I think even then, I think it would strike people as surprising that they pop open a soda and think this is used as a strategic product.
So, from the American cork industry's point of view, how much of a threat was the war in Europe, or indeed, I mean, I guess in 1940, could it be seen as an opportunity?
Well, in some ways. McManus at Crown, Cork and Seal did see the German blockade of the Atlantic as a threat to the supply lines, and others in the industry did too. Smaller companies saw the price of their raw materials go up, and many had to find other means of business. McManus for Crown, Cork and Seal found defense contracts as a way to fill in what they couldn't do commercially, but also he did see a way to, maybe there's a way to grow cork domestically as a way to sort of get away from foreign supplies. So he worked with his corporate chemist and botanists and mapped out possible climate zones where cork oaks could grow in the U.S. and set off a whole campaign to get people to grow cork oak trees.
The funny thing about cork is it's a bit like tea, isn't it? It doesn't really grow anywhere. Attempts had been made previously to export cork plants to the US and failed?
Yeah, you're right. Cork oak acorns were the viability didn't last that long. So Thomas Jefferson, going back in the 1700s, was fascinated by cork and how it was used in capping wine casks and things. So he wanted to grow it at his home in Monticello. But the Atlantic Passage at that point took too long. So the cork acorns couldn't survive that passage. It wasn't until the mid 1800s when you had faster ships that you could actually try to grow cork in North America and have some success. So when they eventually they did in the mid to late 1800s in California, they found climate was good and some people started planting cork oak trees with the idea that they could produce cork, and as a wine industry started, maybe they could adapt it that way.
But in 1940, this wasn't a commercial entity or viable enough to fill in the gaps with the trade from Europe.
That's right. Yeah, there was for cork plantations in the U.S. were just non-existent really at 1940, and people didn't know how to strip the trees by that point. Even though some plants, some of the trees had been planted in the 1800s, nobody really knew. It wasn't a tradition or culture that had infrastructure or knowledge in North America at that point.
It's amazing. So they go around planting 7,500 acorns a year. I mean, which presumably, I mean, I don't know how quick cork grows, but I can't imagine it's ready for harvesting by 1945.
You're right. That was one of the first things that struck me in reading articles about this. A big promotion of you had state governors urging 4-H groups and planting trees very ceremonially on the state capitol grounds, saying we can grow this for patriotic reasons, and we can make America self-sufficient in cork. But it's a long-term investment. The trees have to grow like 20 years before you can, get a first harvest of cork. Even then, they probably realized the war would not last that long. But it was an opportunity.
So for the Europeans, for the Portuguese and the Spanish, I mean, what does war mean for them when I presume everybody's clamouring for their goods? I mean, there must also be a thing, if you're dealing with certainly Spain, but the Iberian Peninsula has already had to go through the Spanish Civil War, which must have disrupted trade. So, I mean, I don't know if that helped. I did wonder if the Spanish Civil War helped them work in adverse situations, because the Spanish Civil War finishes and you get the Second World War, which is another very adverse situation, presumably for neutral countries to be trading it in.
That's a good question. The Spanish Civil War, I think, did hurt it disrupted life and industry in Spain, and Portugal remained and became even stronger as a cork exporter. But then as you get into the Second World War, both countries are selling to both sides of the war. So you have, in the same article, you have articles about the Nazis scooping up Spanish harvests of cork in 1939, 1940, paying a premium. And so, I mean, Spanish exporters are getting some benefit from that. And in Portugal, companies are carefully dealing with both sides also. Sometimes under different names, they're exporting to one side and using a different owner's name to export to Hitler.
It's wonderfully complicated. But then you get the Portuguese trade increased to Germany from 2% to 25%. I mean, the trees in Portugal must have been stripped bare by the end of 1945. I mean, it strikes me as demand must have been through the roof.
The demand was high, but because it was state-controlled, because Salazar kept such an iron control on industry, and they had several foresters in charge who had long-term visions for sustainable forestry. It didn't cut into the core of their supply. So they were selling to both sides, and they had a huge demand, but they were managing it. What they worried about was it seemed like the Portuguese cork industry was concerned that by American cork growing efforts might replace them ultimately, or just the disruption of the war with the cross-Atlantic trade would disrupt their exports that way.
How is business conducted? Does it literally go to the highest bidder, or is there some sort of... it's very difficult for these neutral countries to be neutral, and a lot of them are neutral in different ways depending on how the war's going.
Exactly, yeah. Portugal, and then there's the secret police in Portugal, or their activity in arrests was affected by the way the war was going. So when Germany was doing better, the Portuguese secret police would crack down harder, both on refugees as well as on anybody selling to the Allies. And then when the Allies were doing better, they would back off and sort of navigate it that way.
So if we return to Crown Cork, I mean, it has various, and it's a big company. I mean, it's one of those big companies you've never heard of. It has operations throughout Europe, including Britain, Portugal, Spain. They're in the Netherlands. Presumably they're in other places in Europe. How does the war directly affect them? Presumably they're left untouched in 1940, with America being neutral.
Yeah, although so in 1940, when France fell, the Crown Cork offices in Belgium and Netherlands closed. They were just no longer able to do business internationally, and the restrictions are too much. So their staffs were fleeing as well. So the Crown Cork manager in Portugal ends up helping them and others get from the French-Spanish border across Spain and into Portugal to a sort of safe haven. But yeah, it affected the business quite a bit. As Charles McManus Jr. told me, he said, well, the only access they still had during the war, it was kind of a bit of luck to have their export facility from Portugal still open and still going. That was the thread that they held on to.
Well, Charles McManus Jr. had left London in, 1939 because of the... Was it the bombing, or was it the fact that his factory had disappeared?
No, it was the bombing, actually. The factory had disappeared kind of as a preventive measure. The manager had relocated it to protect it from the bombing, and the problem was it was then inoperable until they put things back into place.
What happened to my factory?
Where did everything go?
Yeah. probably panicking over where all the bits of machinery had disappeared to and are just spread across the country in various crates. Now, it's the international nature of Crown Cork that brings it to the attention of the OSS, the American Office of Strategic Services. Presumably, for a start, they're monitoring Cork before we get to planting agents and things. It must have been a vital barometer.
That's right. Yes, the FBI and OSS were both monitoring trade very closely, particularly in the early 1942, 1943, and particularly from these neutral countries to see what was coming in, what was coming out, because they had so few sources of information inside those countries that knew the economic barriers, and the economic flows were so important. Tungsten, which was then called wolfram, was another important commercially traded item from Spain and Portugal, and it was also key to the defense industry for hardening wartime materiel and other equipment. So Cork and tungsten trade numbers were right in front and center of the OSS director.
The OSS, it becomes interesting in Crown Cork, and it sees it as an opportunity to place agents in, is it the whole of the Iberian Peninsula? How do they go about doing that? I mean, do they insert their people into Crown Cork, or do they train Crown Cork employees James Bond style?
They actually look at both of those options. The OSS approaches Crown Cork in their international management in New York, and they sit down and say, the OSS has limited opportunities with official spies. Our own staff don't have the latitude to travel to key points in the ports and warehouses in the cork growing areas. So, but companies that have a natural reason to be there, like Crown Cork or like Armstrong Cork, are great opportunities for undercover work. And so, they ask, can we either draw on some of your staff and pay them to be undercover for us, or can we insert some of our candidates for jobs that you might need? And so they have that conversation, and for both Spain and Portugal, and they end up deciding that, well, one of the Crown Cork managers in Portugal and Spain is originally Catalan. He's fluent. He knows the business. He's savvy. So he's a good prospect to be an undercover agent. At the same time, they also recruit from places like Armstrong Cork. So you have a young guy he had studied in Europe, so he could do well in Europe in the Spanish context, and they recruited and trained him as direct OSS staff, and put him in an area that was rife with Gestapo activity.
Did they train them at all, or did they just sort of send them in to Portugal and Spain with a list of things to look out for? I mean, how close is that relationship between the OSS and these employees of Crown Cork?
Of Crown Cork, it seemed like they mainly gave them a list of what they needed and sent them in with that. It's not clear how much training they got. The ones from the Cork industry that they recruited for direct kind of OSS officer positions, they did give more stateside training before sending them into the situation. And I think it depended maybe partly on how sensitive the areas where they were going in were.
Lisbon is famously a hotbed of intrigue, isn't it? Where these men presumably be working from. I mean, do they have any other relationships, say, with their British counterparts? Because I made a note that there's Kim Philby, Graham Greene, Ian Fleming are all sort of at some point in Lisbon. Are they brushing shoulders with these? Certainly post-war luminaries who were working for the British at the time? Yes,
there was a fascinating scene there. Yeah, as you say, Graham Greene and Kim Philby, they cultivated some of the same informants. There was just a lot of activity, and you would find agents dead in the Lisbon harbor on one side, and open killings in the Hotel Avenida another day. So it was dangerous work. But particularly for the staff, for the career spies were up to all kinds of things.
So, how did these two guys, is it Massa and Ginsberg, fit in with the OSS hierarchy? I mean, are they literally just been told, can you find out who so-and-so is buying his cork from, or are they trundling around picking up other bits of information?
As far as I can learn from their families and from the documentation, they were given lists of like what they could get from who was dealing to which side, and how were they exporting, and how were potentially black market activities unfolding. Because if they could understand and contain the black markets and the shipments going to Germany, then they could cut off another part of the German war machine.
Presumably all these buyers, there must be large numbers of them hiding who they're buying for, so nobody's quite sure, even for the Portuguese who's purchasing. It just disappears.
Absolutely, yeah. It was, and then the Portuguese border with Spain too there was a wide zone of illegal activity. It was a very porous border for certain things like black markets, because you got border guards who are not getting paid much, and it's just you can shift things so that exports can go through without the right documentation.
It's fantastic. Presumably there's agents working for German versions of Crown Cork doing this counter counting cork shipments and things as well. Whatever is the German version of Crown Cork. I was trying to think of a witty German name and I can't off the top of my head.
There were and some of the cables that came from Lisbon to Washington documented the German importing firm that was basically the counterpart to Crown Cork, and how they were shipping in as much as they could, buying up from the Portuguese.
I'm guessing cork is no longer a strategic product. It's been usurped by plastics. No doubt helped from the technology developed during the war. Is that? Did Crown Cork see that coming?
No, they didn't really see it coming. They thought that, I talked to actually a former U.S. Treasury Secretary, Michael Blumenthal, who worked for Crown Cork in the 50s. And even then, he saw the shift coming to plastic. And he said, I asked his manager, Ginsburg, of isn't this shift, aren't we vulnerable to this, cheaper, more flexible material, plastic, but Ginsburg and others were saying no. It has to do with the taste of the beverage. It's not, they'll never shift to plastics, and so they were caught off guard.
I did wonder if actually, if you're going to buy shares, it might be something that might be a resurgence as we're increasingly moving away from plastic.
Well, that's right. The cork industry about 20 years ago saw that, they were getting hit hard by plastic. There was even a kind of a ceremonial funeral for cork on Wall Street. They carried a casket, a coffin of representing the cork industry. But since then, they've invested more in R&D and improved the quality of the product. And there's, as you say, there's a lot of public concern to get more sustainable than all this huge mountains of plastic that just don't break down. So replacing it with something more organic, more green and eco-friendly, cork is having another day.
Well, what happened to all those cork trees that were planted? Surely America must be potentially awash with cork, with whatever it'll be, 30 or 40,000 cork trees planted during the war.
And they're probably there. People don't even know. I actually did find some growing in California still from that time, and they do know them. They're labeled there. They're recognized there. They're not being harvested, but they're because there's still not the kind of the infrastructure around the industry. But people also in the American South, some of the older ones who remember actually planting the cork trees during then, know that they're still there, and they told me they're still alive and growing. But a lot of people don't know what they look like or even what they might be.
They're just there to be harvested. So, how does this sort of wartime story to track down? It is such an obtuse story. How did you stumble upon it? How hard is it to track down? It
is an obtuse story. I think because sort of this collective forgetting of this product, because of plastics, is always seems like it's always been with us. So I think the fact that there was the secrecy of the OSS activity in general and not declassified until a decade ago, and the fact that it was a material that nobody now would suspect of being a national security item. I came across an article. It was kind of by chance, I was really working on another project, a book about the 1930s and going into the early 40s about writers during that time. I came across an article about this tree growing campaign for patriotic uses to grow cork to make America self-sufficient. It struck me as an odd campaign, so I looked into it and then started talking with people, and that's when I came across Charles McManus Jr., and he told me how that fire was such a milestone event. It really triggered many things that came after that into that campaign, and how it affected their lives from there. So I knew at that point that was an interesting story.
Oh, it is such an interesting story. It is such an interesting story. It's completely, slightly, left field. It's wonderful. I find it fascinating. Even after the war, they start tracking Russian sales of cork. I mean, there's a whole new book there because these George Le Carre books. You can't imagine them talking about cork.
That's right. Yeah, going into the Cold War, it becomes another issue where Stalin has spent decades and a lot of thousands of acres and hectares devoted to cork plantations to try to make the Soviet Union self-sufficient in this same vital material. So I came across another CIA report about Soviet bloc countries growing cork and what it meant to global security. So you're right. It could be a series.
Well, I guess if you were asking people what kind of bellwether you would see cork for, they would suggest sort of fizzy drinks or carbonated drinks and how much people are drinking of those.
Right, yeah.
You would be unlikely to say it shows how many engine units, seals or something like that were being produced. It's just not a barometer that one would normally think of. I guess in the defence sphere. David, thank you for joining me. Thank you for your time and suggesting the topic. Loyal listener, if we've whetted your appetite to learn more about cork, the book to get is Cork Wars by David A. Taylor. It really is a fascinating subject. I'll put a link for the book on the website. So that's it for this episode. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook. Why not give me a like or a follow? It's always nice to get your comments. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.